On today's episode, we're going to talk about the
things we leave behind.
That's right, Benny boy. We're going to talk about Grandma's Drewy, maybe a special car.
Her urn. What do we do with it?
Who wants it?
Let's find out.
Let's talk about death, baby. Let's talk about grief and mourning. Is it argumental or existential? What's it mean to me? Let's talk about death.
Hi, I'm Benny Capal, and I'm a funeral professional.
And I'm Nicholas Capal, a psychologist.
Hey, Nick, let's talk about death.
Let's do it.
Doc, we are going to talk about something that most people don't even think about after they've lost their loved one until they're cleaning out the house and they come across the things that their loved one left behind. So today we're going to talk about the things we leave behind.
Yeah, it's a really, I think, a really good topic because a lot of people that have come into my room have talked about, cleaning out dads or moms or their husbands or wives' closets or houses. And they come across these things that they're not sure what to do with. Because to the deceased loved one, these things were probably very important to them. So, I'll give you an example. One of the things that tends to come up a lot is urns. So, let's say your grandfather passed away and his ashes were given to your dad. Now your dad died. Now the urn with your grandfather are in there. But if you think of this multi-generationally, this is a problem because what eventually happens in my experience is then it gets handed down to, let's say, a great-great-great-grandson who didn't know the deceased. So he has this urn that has ashes of his relative that he never knew.
He does have no connection.
And he has no connection to it, and then he doesn't want to display it. And then he feels guilty about burying it in a closet. And the problem is this is a topic that most people don't talk about, and it's an important topic. And I always tell that to the families I work with, if you're going to think about cremation, is kind of have a plan of what happens to your remains down the line. So I think it's an important topic to bring to a lot of people's attention because when a sudden death happens, or even a long-term death, these things are left behind and you're not sure what to do with. Another one that I hear a lot of is military stuff. So maybe great-grandfather had all of his pendants and pins and
awards,
all that stuff, right? And again, generationally, that could be really cool for certain people. Not cool for everybody, right? So again, this is the problem. When people die, there's things left behind. The other one I heard a lot of is when people have those pets that live for 50, 100 years.
Oh, yep.
Like birds.
Pets, yep. What do I do with the parakeet?
Yeah, what do I do with Wally the parakeet?
Wally. Well, Doc, I'll bring up a couple examples. And what's interesting about this is we are generationally changing too, right? So the big thing that would change is what do we do? Because the one thing I always hear, right, is grandma or great-grandma had bins or garbage bags full of pictures, like the actual hand pictures, the ones that, you would actually get developed. For you that don't know, we're probably aging ourselves here.
Or the negatives,
right? So
someone on here is like, what are negatives?
What are they talking about here? They're in the red room right now. The other guys are like, yeah, we hear you. But yeah, so they have all these pictures and it's like, what do we do with them? Or even worse, you have these black and white photos that they have no idea who the people are in it because they didn't label them. So yet again, there's no connection. And then there's this search for, do I give them to great aunt that may or may not have some feeling to these pictures? Another big thing that I'm thinking, Doc, and I think we need to talk about with the new generation is our phones, right? Because our phones literally have everything on them. And I remember a couple families have told me, and it's not unheard of, that they'll keep paying for their loved one's cell bill back when there was voicemails. so they could hear their loved one's voice one or two more times, or every day if they needed to, or every week or whatnot. And that's an interesting, like, we've gone to technology now. So in our phones, we have all the pictures, we have all the videos, but then also our private stuff is in our phones now, right? The conversations we've had, that maybe you don't necessarily want your family finding, bad, good, indifferent. We're not here to judge. It's just the thing of, what do we do now, right? So, your loved one dies, and maybe you're the only one that has this opportunity to have this phone. Is that something that you want to go into? Is that something that you're just like, you know what, that is their privacy, let's leave it be? But that's another thing too that brings up these things that we leave behind, because I do hear the pictures. I also hear, like, dad had a really fancy car that he spent all day on every Saturday, cleaning, waxing, all that. I have no concept of, like, this car is cool or not. So am I doing a disservice to my father by selling the car? But also I don't want to keep it if I don't know how to maintain it, and then it just basically goes in the garage and it's under a sheet for 20, 30 years. And then you're absolutely right, Doc. Here's the problem, and I think it goes back to the conversation we had earlier, which, if you get a chance, listen to our death checklist, because the big thing of this is it's an easy conversation that we may or can have with our loved ones, to be like, hey, when my time comes, I have, because a lot of people are collectors, right? So some people don't want to collect old magazines or old Pokemon cards or blah, 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 blah. So have a plan with your kids or your loved ones or whatever. Like, hey, you might not feel anything for my Star Trek collection. So if you want to sell them, that's fine. If you want to give them to, your kids, the grandkids, that's cool. If nobody wants them, sell them, get rid of them, anything you want. But that way you're giving an out to your loved ones, because in most cases, they're not going to haunt us from the grave because we didn't keep the first edition Charizard, which, if you have one out there, it's worth some money. But it's one of those things where there is all of these extra things too, because it's not just, it's pictures, it's cars, it's dad's favorite poster, it's dad's records or mom's records that she literally, you can see how much she played, with the record and the needle on it. And it's all of these things that's just one more thing, Doc. And that's another thing too. A lot of these times you don't see these things or may not know that you had a connection to until you open mom's house the next week, right?
Dad and mom's matching bowling balls. What do you do with them? What do you do
tough.
with them?
That's tough. That's real tough.
Do you display them? Or they're trophies for winning, tournaments or whatever? Like, I don't know.
So what do you do in the clinical side when somebody is messing with this idea of, what do I do? Like, where do I go with this? Like, how do you address
I think
them?
the dangerous part is that it does bring guilt and shame. Meaning they have, like, for example, what I brought up, the urn. And I don't know what mom would want me to do with this. And if I get rid of it, then is she going to haunt me from the grave? Or, I hear that all the time. And it's like, did mom specifically tell you to keep it? No. Did mom specifically tell you to get rid of it? No. Then to me, you were left to choose your path. Goosebumps did it best, right? The Goosebump books. Choose your own path. But I think that's the important part is that I think, again, this comes with grief in general, Oh, I didn't spend enough time with mom the last couple years, so I feel like I need to keep her bowling ball.
Mm-hmm. Well, and there's the opposite problem too, Doc. There's the opposite problem of wanting to keep something, but you have other siblings that may not want to. For instance, like the house or the cabin, right? You may have a lot of emotional connection and memories attached to a physical thing, whether that be land, whether that be the cabin, the house, the car, right? But maybe in the will, mom and dad set it up where you'd sell it and split it. Now you're in this situation where you don't want to sell that because you feel like, you have this connection to it. You may or may not even want to buy it off your other siblings, and they don't want anything to do with that. So now you're dealing with another part of this, what we leave behind, because what we think is beneficial to our kids by splitting something, right? Like you sell the house and all four of my kids get a fourth of that money, right? But what if one of those kids really wants that house? Or what if that kid was living in that house up to then? Because as we know, there's a lot of that situation where we live with our parents. We never know what our life is going to be like down the line. So now you have anger, possibly fighting on top of trying to figure out how to navigate what we do with these treasures or sometimes junk, right? That's the other thing too. Mom was a hoarder. Now you're dealing with the extra problem of, I have all of this stuff she found was so important and it's just junk to me. It's absolutely just trash. But then you have the guilt too. So they get home and they're like, well, this was important to mom, or this was important to dad or uncle or cousin. Am I being wrong by thinking this is, junk or trash? Or how do I, get rid of this, but also in a way that is fitting and honorable to these treasures, which may not or may be treasures to.
Or you got the other brother that wants to sell it within 3 months and says, we don't have time to go through all this.
Oh, that stuff too, because some people want to like catalog everything, where others are like, no, let's just have an estate sale and get rid of it all.
Be done with it.
Man, that gets really challenging. So do you have a lot of that in the rooms?
I haven't had that specific case, but I've had a lot of like I said, things left over that they're just not sure what they're supposed to do with them.
Right.
And
right.
Like I said, unfortunately, with COVID, there's been a lot of sudden deaths. So there wasn't time to really
catalog, get things in order.
Talk about this stuff, but I think it's important, dad's class ring.
Oh,
what do I do with that?
Very good.
Do I give it back to the high school? What do I do with it? Do I melt it down? Or, again, guilt and shame.
Here we go. Right.
It's fascinating. It's just, or dad's University of Michigan football collection that he's spent years collecting players' jock straps and stuff like that.
Right. Like,
what do you want to do with that? What do you want to do?
Yeah,
with
if there's
that?
not a local museum or historical something that you can put it on display, like what do you do with that? Because for most people, there's no value to
a kid.
that.
Well, to a kid that maybe one of the children didn't get into football at all, looking at a used men's jock strap is probably not the most
attractive item,
but it was signed by Charles Woodson. So,
well, there's another interesting thing that I deal with in the funeral home is, what do we leave on mom or dad in the casket?
It's a great question,
because what I find is really interesting about that is you don't have a lot of time to think about it in most cases. So you're within that week figuring out, do I want to keep mom's wedding ring that she's never taken off, so she should keep that on? Or should I sell it? Or should I give it to the first grandchild? Or should I keep it and wear dad and mom's marriage bands on a necklace or meld them together? Or like mom had a mom ring. And like, do we keep that ring on? Or dad had his family crest ring. And if we take it off, who gets to keep it? See, that's the other thing too with this is sometimes it may be better to sell it, because by keeping it, there's responsibility on who keeps it, how the others pay it off. But it does get very, very tricky.
Who gets the family
ring?
Bible.
Well, and there you go too. I mean, we've gone from a very faith-based society to an individualistic, spiritual, like maybe holy relics, like old Bibles or golden crucifixes, or these are things. I see it all the time, and it's just interesting because there is a lot more stress and anxiety with grief when you're dealing with these extra not knowing what to do with. And you brought up a good point with COVID and a pandemic. When we're dealing with a lot of younger individuals dying tragically, you're right, they weren't prepared, and so a lot of older parents thinking that they would die before their kids are now taking care of their kids. So it gets really interesting, and especially if you add maybe the person is in the middle of a horrible divorce at the time, or maybe because death is never on schedule by any means, form, or shape too. So it is interesting, these things we leave behind. Would you suggest, like I said, Doc, that maybe you just have the conversation with your loved ones, like, hey, like, listen, I love Star Trek. You don't. You're a Star Wars person. I'm a Trekkie. You don't get it. Feel free to keep it, get rid of it, do whatever. You're not going to hurt my feelings. Like, just a conversation like that.
Well, I just think the big ticket items. Make sure you talk about what your expectations are after you're gone. And to be fair, even if those are your expectations, doesn't necessarily mean they're going to happen that way.
Well, it's funny you say big ticket items, because sometimes when families I know come in after, the 6 month that we talk about all the time, when they come back in the funeral home, they'll say the thing that they found buried deep in the thing, a bookmark or something that literally has no value other than memories, to them is more important than the $5,000 gold ring. You know what I mean? So it's interesting that you bring up the big ticket items, because what is a big ticket item, really?
Well, like I said, I think there is, obviously there's going to be, if there's multiple children, there's divorce, there's going to be some issues with how things get split up or whatnot, or probate if you need to deal with that, which is always a nightmare. But it just is a topic that I thought to myself maybe needs to be talked about, because especially with people that have urns on their mantles, like let's bring it down 5 more generations. What's going to happen to them?
We bring it up a ton, Doc. Dad and I, when we're doing arrangements, is please have some sort of plan for what you're going to do a generation from now or 2 generations from now. And I think that's the biggest problem, going back to cremation. And we've talked about this before. It's a wonderful form of disposition, but it also has its drawbacks. And the biggest drawback that I find with it is there's just so much you can do with it. There's so much you can do. You can keep it. You can scatter it 2 years down the line, 10 years down the line. You can keep it. You can try to put it in with your loved one's casket down the line. I'm not saying that's legal or not legal, depending on what stage you're in. But it's one of those things where there is so many options. And at the time, I think it's a gem to think about, is, oh, I can deal with this later. But almost that adds more stress and anxiety and grief down the line, to add to not only the loved one, but then the loved ones, because that's what tends to happen a lot, is they may or may not have had a plan. They don't tell their kids. So now the kids are dealing with not only their mom's cremated remains, which they may agree or not agree with, and now dad's. And do we put them together? Do we keep them apart? What if I want mom, but you want dad? And then they get separated. And the big thing that I've noticed, Doc, recently is obviously nuclear families aren't as prevalent as they were years ago. So now you're dealing with possible 3 to 4 families with 3 to 4 different sets of kids. So even more so, when these deaths occur, these kids come out of the woodwork and say, like, well, dad meant them more to me because I'm his first kids. I was the first set of kids. And then the others was like, well, no, dad loved our mom and we're the last kids, so we're the more, and this, and I know it sounds comical, but it's so true to everybody out there, and we see it all the time, and it's really hard when you're adding these little trinkets, because for some people, that's means the world to them to have mom's snow globe collection, or mom's precious moment. Our mom is a lovely precious moment collector.
Or mom's cookbook, right?
Cookbook with all the recipes. And so, or you can look at the opposite, Doc. Maybe these things not only are traumatic to this person because maybe they didn't have a good relationship, or maybe these items were more important to their loved one than they were. So now they have to deal with it. So you add this compounded mental distress on top of trying to figure out what we do with these items. So I think it is a very interesting topic because nobody talks about it. I mean, nobody talks about death in general, and so I think it's wonderful, Doc, that you brought this to our attention, and I think it's something. And for all you listeners out there, send us an email or a thought if you have any specific items that maybe you dealt with or your parents dealt with or a loved one of yours that you were like, man, what do we do with, or maybe just give us a kudos if you get what we're talking about. And you can email us at letstalkaboutdeathpod@gmail.com. But Doc, I think it's time to go out there on the emails and answer some questions. What do you think?
Let's do it.
Q&A, everyone loves that Q&A.
Okay, here we go, Doc. This one is from Stephanie Jordan. Hi! There's an exclamation mark there. I find your podcast to be quirky and interesting. I have some interesting thoughts on death. So do we. To give you an understanding of my experience, my father died when I was 4 and my husband died in December of 2014. My mom and I were the same age when we became widows. I survived this tsunami of death with 5 kiddos, homeschooling, and running a salon company. If you think this message could encourage your audience, I would love to chat with you. Even facing the hardest of circumstances, when we can see death as the usher and not always an enemy, it is helpful. Thanks, guys. And yet again, that's from Stephanie Jordan. So, Stephanie, first and foremost, thank you for reaching out to us, and we will get you on this show. Oh, we will. So my thoughts are, what I think was really interesting and visceral and impactful for me was when she said she became a widow the same year her mom did. So the idea that you lose your dad and then you lose your husband at the same time, because it is interesting as kids, I'm starting to see it with my parents and their parents. There comes a time when you become your parents' parents, because you have to help them through the ending cycle of life, and you got to kind of help them make decisions and all that. You become almost a parent to your parents. It's very strange, and I'm starting to see it. So that has to be very tough when you're dealing with your own grief, your own loss of your loved one, but also trying to help your mother go through her journey of becoming a widow. And you becoming a widow at such a young age, it's got to be very isolating. And so I really appreciate you reaching out and being vulnerable in that. Raising 5 kiddos, if I'm not mistaken, I have 2, and adding 3 more to that bunch would be something. And doing your own salon and homeschooling, you are the definition of the total package of a mom. So from all of your kids, I want to say thank you, because I'm sure they have some wonderful experiences. And yeah, it's interesting you said usher, especially with all of that, because I think that's the lesson the listeners can learn, is that if you can spin this grief in a positive way, instead of always looking at it so negatively, I think you can come with some love. And there's certain things that you wouldn't have been able to do without that experience in your life. So yet again, I think it's very awesome. I think you're incredible as a mom, and I would love to talk to you, just because I'm sure you have some stories that could really, really be impactful to Doc and I in our own grief journey. Doc, you have any thoughts on that?
Well, no, I've literally been sitting here spinning on the word usher, and I was thinking about how death can be an usher. And it's interesting because, of course, I'm a very visual guy, so I have I don't know if everybody heard Phantom of the Opera is going to be stopping from Broadway, which is really sad.
Tragic.
I'm going to agree with that right now. It is a tragedy. I don't know why I just went straight to the theater of Phantom of the Opera, and I thought about death being an usher. And it's interesting because I like the idea of death being a guide. To help us maybe live more fruitful, fulfilling lives. But I think that death is, I like this idea of a guide, of usher, because I think that sometimes they can be. I think of like ushers, right? I think of church. Like we have ushers at church, and they're like, "You gotta go sit over here," and maybe it's not the place you want to sit, but that's where you're going, right?
They always have the cool jackets.
They do really.
They always have, like,
this is
those
the Catholic
green-
experience we're
Yeah.
talking about here, but like, but I want to say this because I think sometimes we don't have a choice of where death is going to guide us to, and that's an interesting thing to think of an usher because sometimes we don't have a choice of where we're going to sit. We're told where we're going to sit. So you got me thinking. I got my wheels spinning here.
man.
I don't have enough time to really come up with it, but I like it.
I'm so viscerally thinking about this now.
You
I'm
and
even
your
thinking
visceral
the
on this episode.
the usher thing with either
Usher,
a guy in a
usher.
gondola, like taking you down the river now because of Phantom, or I'm thinking of
a
the
gondola.
gondola, right? Am I saying it wrong?
Gondola.
It's the same thing.
Yes.
Potato. And then the other thing was I was thinking
Gondola?
about the teenager with the red vest at the movie theater. And he's got to walk down the aisles, and he has a cool flashlight that, like, this is your seat.
Yeah, no, I'm thinking. I like the idea.
I like it a lot.
We're, you know what? When you're on the episode,
Companion.
we're gonna come back to that. We're gonna spin some wheels on that one for a while because I really like that idea.
Death, your best,
Death the usher.
your greatest spiritual animal, your spirit animal. Death.
I like usher.
I like
I like the-
Usher.
Yeah.
Well, thank you
A
so
lot of thoughts. A lot of thoughts.
Thank you so much for contacting us. And if you have any thoughts or just kind of want to tell your story, like we would love to tell it out here to all the listeners out there because we all deal with death and grief. You can contact us yet again on our email at letstalkaboutdeathpod@gmail.com. I challenge you right now to get out your phones and whatever you're listening to this episode on, whether it be Spotify or iTunes, please give us give us your comments, your thoughts, write a review. This helps out a ton. We want to keep doing this, but we need your help to keep it going. And we appreciate everybody who's listening. And if you have any thoughts, please, like I said, get at us. And if you are not talking about death,
You are not living.